argument that he was making. And I think you've done a very good job in, dismissing it as the fork in the road that was once claimed to be. But I think maybe in keeping up with, David Deutsch and, the beginning of Infinity, I must confess that I have not yet read the whole book, but I have read bits and pieces of it, and I've done a lot of research on it, and was very pleased actually to find out that Karl Popper was one of the influences for this book, who I have read and I'm a huge admirer of. And I think maybe just to begin talking about the book, I must say that it has a lot of physics in it, about which I know very little, and am just a curious, layperson, because I obviously don't have the sufficient scientific background to, fully grasp the physics of the book. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time on that, but, not too much. But there is so much in the book that I wish for us to discuss. And I think the opening segment, just meshes in very well with what I wish to talk about now. So, just talking about Popper, he mentions the scientific method of discovering what it is that's true and what it is that's not, and by extension, what is a good explanation and what isn't. And I think maybe to talk to the opening remarks that you have just made, how do people determine what it is that's true? How do we know what is a good explanation and what isn't? Because it seems to me that you have a very particular way of determining, or particular method, I think, is the more important thing. So I think the method is far more important than the outcomes that you reach. So I think you've got a very interesting method by which you discern what it is that's true and what it is that's false, at least in your view, and the methods that were used to come up with what it is that's true and what it is that's false. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that, and of course why David Deutsch is such a huge influencer of yours.
Sure. I think it's reasonable to describe Deutsch as having generalized the Popperian framework, extended it beyond the realms of what I might describe as narrow science. The idea, to summarize Popper, the idea of Popper really is that knowledge growth, knowledge generation, proceeds by way of conjecture and criticism. That the way in which knowledge evolves is by way of somebody coming up with an hypothesis, a conjecture, an explanation. Those are the terms that are used more or less equivalently. And that explanation then being exposed to criticism. Falsification, right. Another term for it. Right. Refutation, another term. And that is in some quarters described as falsification or falsificationism. And it's a kind of approach that says, look, you can never say with absolute certainty that some explanation is true. All we have is good explanations that are surviving the test of time and multiple attempts to refute them.
Right.
And so a theory is never said to be true in an absolute sense. It's merely said to have not yet been proven false. And in fact, adherents of this school of thinking very often say things like, all explanations are false. We just don't know why yet, in all cases. Or they will say that all explanations are destined to be replaced by better ones. And so they'll use an example like Newtonian mechanics. Now, Newtonian mechanics was used very successfully in all sorts of applications with no problems whatsoever for a couple of hundred years. And then along comes Einstein with another explanation that completely contradicts the Newtonian mechanics. And people had to think very hard about what experiments you'd perform to try and falsify one of the two. And in the end, the sort of clinching experiment involved a very complex astronomical observation at the time of eclipse, watching what happened to the passage of light from a star located behind the sun. So did we see the light bend or not? That was the essential question. And detailed measurements had to be made, and people had to be sent all around the world to station themselves in the right locations in order for the required observations to be made. And that experiment very famously refuted the Newtonian mechanics. It didn't refute Einstein's theories, but the measurement was only made because of Einstein's explanation. Nobody would have thought to make that experiment to refute Newtonian mechanics until another explanation, a competing explanation, came along. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Popperian framework is about. Popper has a kind of demarcation going on where he says that if a theory is not falsifiable, then it's not scientific. So he classes knowledge into scientific and non-scientific, if you like, using this demarcation. What Deutsch says is that, no, he doesn't go along with that. All knowledge, all of all sorts, all explanations of all sorts, whatever domain they're in, are in principle falsifiable, even if we don't know how to falsify them at the moment. And so he would say, we always look to get closer to the truth, to correspond to reality in all domains, whether we are talking about morality or aesthetics or science, as we traditionally understand it. And the Deutschian analysis is I find very persuasive and very powerful. And of course, what it suggests is that there is an objective moral reality, there is an objective aesthetic reality. And I don't have a problem with those ideas. I think that the relativist conception is wrong. The idea that, for example, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We know because great works of art are independently admired by diverse people.
Surely a spanner in the works can be thrown there, though. So you use art as an example, and I think that's a pretty good example to use to verify the analogy that you're speaking of now. But I think morality is a much more difficult one to place in either box, be it relative or objective. I think it falls somewhere in the middle, because it's clear to me that what we claim to be moral today and what was claimed to be moral 100 years ago aren't quite the same things. Perhaps the bases may be the same, and I think that's at least the underlying principle of objectivism, that Inuits, for instance, will chew the boots of the men who are going out, not because chewing boots is some lavish thing that we can do in all societies, but because they do so as an expression of love and to warm up the boots for those that are going out. So perhaps the chewing of the boots itself might not be considered universal and objective, but the underlying principle, the reason they're doing it, is what's universal. I've heard arguments of that nature. I think you could make the argument with art, but I'm not so sure you could proceed in the same way with morality.
Well, the way the Deutschian philosopher would respond to that is to say, yes, and the standards of the past are different from the standards of today. But that's another way of saying that we replaced the explanations of the past with better ones. So, for example, you might contemplate the notion of slavery, the institution of slavery. At some point, at many points in history, slavery has been considered to be a completely moral enterprise. No problem with the idea that a human can be owned by another human being. But it took a different set of moral explanations for people to perceive that moral reality persisted or was involved a recognition of, let's call it, the divinity in every human being, the agency of every human being, the value.
The inhabitant of the breast, as Adam Smith will call it.
The inhabitant of the breast, exactly. These kinds of ideas, those are really moral explanations. They are theories, hypotheses, if you like, that if a society adopts them, does the society do well? Does it become a flourishing society, a generative society, or not? That's kind of the criticism, the test, the refutation would be, okay, so in a society characterized by authoritarianism and slave-like status for most of the population, how does that society compare to a free society where people have rights that are protected by the state and so on? And you would look and say, okay, does the Soviet Union grow fast or does America grow fast? And you would make conclusions on, about which system is preferable. It's kind of a way of testing the explanations, and those are moral explanations.
But even that, ensconced within that is the presupposition that we should prioritize growth over non-growth, and I think that is in itself worthy of an explanation.
Absolutely, and so my answer to that is that knowledge growth should be prioritized, and a side effect of knowledge growth is economic growth. Why? Because knowledge growth, what it consists of, what it is solving problems. new knowledge is created in response to a perceived problem. And what I mean by problem is not necessarily like some development, adverse development. A problem could be just the absence of something that we want, or the presence of something that we don't want, or an inconsistency that we've observed in our thoughts or in our actions or something. That then there's a problem, and new knowledge is what solves problems. And we want to solve problems. We want to create new knowledge. A side effect of creating new knowledge is economic growth, because you're finding efficient ways of doing things, better ways of doing things, ways for people to have more of goods, services, happiness, time, whatever. How you apply the growth or the fruits of the labor is a separate question. That comes to morality. Do we choose to spend our money on the trinkets, the baubles, or do we spend them on things that are more experiential, that have more benefit for other people or for nature or whatever? That's another matter altogether. But I would suggest that knowledge growth is kind of an ultimate virtue. That's the high. It would have to be called it's a conjecture. This idea. Maybe the ultimate moral good is that which supports knowledge growth, and the ultimate moral evil is that which destroys the means of error correction, so that we keep making the same mistakes and we never improve. And so I feel quite strongly that no, growth is an unfettered good.
Yeah.
It's what we do with it that is worth consideration and worth analysis of a sort that I would call moral realism.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with that. So the reason I asked the question was because it seems to me, certainly what I got from doing research about the book, is that you've got to be able to at least explain even the presuppositions that you bring into the arguments that you make. And growth seems a pretty intuitive axiom that we all accept. We should be growing in more ways than one. Not just economically, not just mentally, or in terms of spirituality, etc. But it seemed to me that it was important to be able to provide sufficient explanation as to why that is the case. And I think maybe that's where I have a bit of a confusion, so to speak, because it seems to me that if you're going to demand an explanation for everything that is believed, then I don't think you're going to get very far, because every single thing that presupposes that has to be explained. So the explanation must get an explanation in and of itself, basically, and the premises that underlie that particular explanation must themselves be explained. And it seems to me that that's an endless rabbit hole that nobody's going to get to the bottom of.
Well, that's where the term infinity is important in the title of the book.
Right.
The fact that we lack explanations for so many phenomena doesn't cause us to challenge the idea that good explanations are a good thing,
right?
And that we'd like to have explanations for these complex phenomena. The important point is that knowledge generation only takes place by way of an evolutionary process of conjecture and criticism. And in order for that to happen,